Do you think every family has a villain, or is it more complicated?
You know, it's one thing to grow up hearing little digs and backhanded comments about how you're too much or not enough, but it's another thing entirely when the people who should be in your corner simply stop pretending they care. And that's what I realized the night I stood on a stage with every reason to be proud, only to look out at the audience and see row after row of strangers cheering for me while the seats I had reserved for my own family sat completely empty, untouched, as though the people who were supposed to love me most had made a conscious choice to prove, in the clearest way possible, that I didn't matter to them. I need to back up though, because this wasn't just about that one night. This was years of being dismissed, years of my mom rolling her eyes every time I brought up the late nights I was putting into my work, years of my dad asking if I was ever going to get a real job, and years of my sister laughing with her friends about how delusional I was for thinking anything would come of what I was building. And yet, every single time they did it, I swallowed the sting. I told myself maybe it was just their way of keeping me grounded. Maybe one day I'd succeed enough that they'd finally show up and say, "We were wrong, we're proud." I guess the thing that hurt most wasn't just their lack of faith, but how casual it became. At Thanksgiving, my cousins would brag about their promotions or their new houses, and the whole table would light up, but if I tried to share something like hitting a milestone or landing a contract, my mom would change the subject. My dad would grunt about the cranberry sauce, and my sister would pull out her phone like she had better things to do. It was like they had made a pact to ignore me until I disappeared, as if acknowledging my hard work would somehow threaten the story they wanted to tell about me being the difficult one, the one who never quite measured up. So when the email came inviting me to give a keynote speech at a national conference, not just attend, but headline, I thought, finally. Finally, this is the thing that will shut them up. Finally, they won't be able to pretend this is just a hobby or a phase. I sent the invitations myself, printed them out so they couldn't claim they didn't see it, and I even called each of them, told them the date, told them how much it would mean to have them there. Told them I wanted to look out into that crowd and know my family was with me. And each of them gave me some half-hearted answer, "We'll see, I'll check my schedule, maybe," but I clung to the idea that when the moment came, they'd realize how important it was. The weeks leading up to that night were brutal. I was working full days, practicing my speech at night, rewriting sentences until they finally sounded right, and running through every possible mistake I might make. But underneath all the nerves, I carried this quiet hope, almost like a secret I was afraid to say out loud, that I would look up from the podium and see my mom's face soft with pride, my dad nodding like he finally got it, my sister maybe even clapping. I wanted that moment more than I wanted the applause of strangers, and I didn't even realize how much until the day came and I walked backstage, shaking from the weight of it all, and peeked out at the rows of seats I had reserved in the front, only to find them exactly as I left them, 3 name cards in place, 3 seats untouched, 3 reminders that no one was coming. It hit me like a punch I should have seen coming. I felt stupid, standing there in a blazer I had borrowed, clutching my notes, pretending I wasn't scanning the room one more time in case maybe they were running late, maybe traffic had slowed them down, maybe they'd slide in just as the lights dimmed. But no. The announcer called my name, the crowd clapped politely, and I walked out knowing, with a kind of cold clarity, that I was completely on my own. And that was the moment everything inside me started to shift, because while part of me wanted to crumple, to let their absence prove they were right, another part of me started to burn, and that part was stronger. I walked up to that podium, set down my notes, and adjusted the microphone. The lights were hot, the faces in front of me expectant, and for a split second I thought about all the nights I had doubted myself, all the times I had wanted to quit, and all the ways my family had reminded me they wouldn't care either way. And then I thought, fine. If they want to pretend I don't exist, let me show them what it looks like when I succeed without them. I opened my mouth and started the speech I had rehearsed 100 times, but I knew, even then, I wasn't going to end it the way I had written it. I wasn't going to give them the option of crawling back later like they had always done. Because when I finished, I was going to look straight into the camera broadcasting this event across the country, and I was going to make sure every single person who had ever doubted me heard exactly what I thought of them. And that's where I'll leave it for now, right before the moment everything shifted, right before the words that would change everything left my mouth, right before the guilt that would eat them alive even started. When I stepped onto that stage, the weight of every disappointment, every eye roll, and every dismissive comment I had endured for years pressed down on me so hard I thought I might stumble. But the applause from the audience, though polite and somewhat distant at first, steadied me just enough to remind myself why I was there, and as I placed my notes on the podium, I caught myself scanning the crowd one last time, desperate in a way I hated to admit for even the faintest chance that my family had changed their minds, that they had slipped in quietly and were watching from the shadows, that I wasn't completely alone, but all I found were strangers' faces glowing in the stage lights. Strangers who had come to hear me speak, while the people I had counted on most couldn't even be bothered to show up. I cleared my throat, adjusted the microphone, and began reading the opening lines exactly as I had practiced, forcing myself to breathe in a steady rhythm so that my voice didn't shake, and for a few minutes I was able to disappear into the flow of the words, focusing on the cadence, the way the audience leaned forward when I hit a point of emphasis, the little murmurs of agreement that gave me the courage to keep going. Yet, even as the speech rolled on, a part of me couldn't stop replaying the sight of those 3 empty chairs with their untouched name cards, each one like a scar carved into the evening, proof that no matter how far I had come, my family had chosen to make a statement louder than any applause that they did not see me, that they did not value what I had achieved, that they believed ignoring me would cut deeper than saying the words out loud. Halfway through, I caught myself gripping the edges of the podium so tightly my knuckles ached, and in that moment a thought crystallized in my mind with a sharpness that startled me. If they didn't want to see me succeed, then I would make sure they couldn't escape the consequences of their choice, because ignoring me in private was one thing, but I had been handed a platform, a microphone, and a live broadcast. And I realized with a kind of fierce clarity that I wasn't going to let this moment pass without turning it back on them. So I kept going, paragraph after paragraph, my voice growing stronger with every line, the audience shifting from polite attention to genuine engagement, and by the time I reached the conclusion, the neat, practiced ending I had rehearsed endlessly in front of my bathroom mirror, I knew I was about to throw it away. I paused, folded the paper in half, and looked directly into the camera lens, my heart pounding so loud it nearly drowned out the silence in the room, and I let the words I had carried like a loaded weapon for weeks spill out. To those who didn't think I'd make it, I said slowly, deliberately, every syllable aimed like an arrow, save your messages. The silence that followed was unlike anything I had ever felt. The room, full of strangers, froze for a split second, and then the applause exploded, louder and sharper than before. But I barely heard it because all I could think about was the ripple effect those words were about to have once the live stream replay hit inboxes and social feeds, once my mother, father, and sister sat down with their phones and realized that the daughter and sister they had dismissed had just sent them a public rejection sharper than any private argument could have been. I walked off that stage with my head high, not because the applause had validated me, not because I had delivered a flawless speech, but because for the first time in my life I hadn't begged for their approval. I hadn't softened my edges to make myself more palatable, and I hadn't left room for them to slither back with empty excuses about traffic or bad timing. I had drawn a line so visible it could be replayed 1,000 times, and I knew, even before I got back to the dressing room, that the people who thought ignoring me would protect their pride were going to find themselves exposed, shamed, and gnawed by the very guilt they had once so casually tossed onto me. When I checked my phone that night, there were already notifications piling up, messages from colleagues praising my courage, clips of my speech spreading online, and emails from people I had never met telling me my words had hit them like a jolt of electricity. But mixed in with that noise, buried but unmistakable, were the frantic missed calls and voicemails from my family, the same people who hadn't bothered to take a single step into the auditorium, now suddenly desperate to talk, to explain, to remind me that family comes first and that they had reasons for not being there, and I sat there staring at the screen, feeling no urge to answer, no guilt, no ache, just a strange calm. Because for the first time in years, The shame was not mine to carry, it was theirs, and they were finally choking on it. The morning after my speech, I woke up to the kind of phone that looked like it had been set on fire overnight, buzzing and vibrating with a relentless stream of missed calls, texts, and notifications, and for a long moment I just lay there staring at it, half amused and half exhausted, because I already knew exactly who had been blowing it up and why, and I wasn't in any rush to give them what they wanted, not after years of being ignored, dismissed, or brushed off as though my life were some hobby they could afford to treat lightly whenever it suited them. I let the screen light up with the words "Mom calling" over and over again, followed by "Dad calling," and then inevitably my sister, who had always been the loudest voice when it came to mocking me, trying now to act like silence could erase what they had done. But the irony was too sharp to miss. They hadn't been able to spare an hour to sit in a room and watch me succeed, yet suddenly they had found endless hours to chase me down after my words, broadcast to the world, finally left a mark too big for them to pretend away. I finally rolled over and opened a few messages just to satisfy my curiosity, and as expected, they were exactly what I thought they would be. My mother insisting she never realized how important it was, my father claiming he had work he couldn't get out of, and my sister typing paragraph after paragraph about how you didn't have to make us look bad on camera, as though somehow my choice to speak the truth had embarrassed them more than their decision to leave those chairs empty ever embarrassed me. It was laughable, really, the speed with which they turned from indifference to panic, like people who had walked past a fire for years only to start screaming once the smoke filled their own lungs, and I couldn't help but feel the smallest flicker of satisfaction. Not because I wanted them to hurt, but because for once the discomfort wasn't mine. But what surprised me most wasn't their reaction. It was how quickly the outside world began to react, because while my family scrambled to figure out how to spin their absence into something forgivable, colleagues, acquaintances, and even complete strangers were flooding my inbox with praise, sharing the clip of me standing on stage, folding up my notes, and delivering that final line with a conviction I hadn't even known I was capable of until the words came out. One colleague sent me a screenshot showing the clip had already been shared thousands of times, captioned with things like, "This is what strength looks like," or "This hit me harder than I expected, and for the first time in my life." The narrative was not controlled by the people who had tried so hard to shrink me. Instead, it was controlled by me, by my words, by the version of myself that had finally stood up and refused to be diminished. That shift did something to me I can't quite describe, because while I had spent years secretly hoping my family would validate me, that hope evaporated almost instantly as the messages rolled in from people who actually cared enough to listen. People who weren't related to me by blood, but who had chosen to be present, and it forced me to confront a truth I had avoided for far too long. I didn't need them to clap for me. I didn't need them to show up in order for my success to mean something. And maybe the cruelest, but most freeing realization of all was that they needed me now far more than I needed them. Still, I won't lie, there was a part of me that wanted to answer just once, to pick up when my sister called for the 10th time and listen to her stumble through excuses. Or to hear my father's voice crack as he tried to frame himself as too busy rather than too indifferent, but I stopped myself, because I knew if I gave them that opening, they would twist it back into their story, a story where I was ungrateful, where I was dramatic, where I was making mountains out of molehills. Instead, I chose silence, and I can't tell you how powerful it felt to hold that silence, to know they were stewing in their own guilt with no lifeline from me, to realize that after years of being the one who called and begged for scraps of attention, I was finally the one who didn't need to explain myself. That night, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine, watching the replay of my own speech that someone had uploaded, and I noticed something I hadn't caught in the moment, the audience's faces right after I said that line. The way the silence broke into applause not just because of the words themselves, but because they could feel the weight behind them, the years of frustration and invisibility all poured into a single sentence. And I thought, if complete strangers could feel that, then there was no way my family hadn't felt it too, sitting at home with their phones in their hands, realizing they had been called out in front of more people than they could ever face. And as much as they wanted to downplay it, I knew in my gut that the guilt had already started its work on them, because guilt is a strange thing. It doesn't shout, it whispers, it circles. It digs in slowly until every quiet moment is filled with a reminder of what you did wrong, and by ignoring their calls, by refusing to let them off the hook, I was making sure that whisper became a roar they couldn't escape. I leaned back, closed my laptop, and let myself smile for the first time in a long time, because this was just the beginning, and I was far from finished. In the days that followed, I realized that the silence I chose was doing far more damage than any carefully worded speech or long, emotional confrontation ever could, because while my family was used to dismissing me when I called to share good news, or ignoring me when I tried to include them in my milestones, they were not at all prepared for what it felt like to be the ones on the outside, calling over and over, only to find their names pushed into voicemail, their texts left unanswered, and their excuses met with nothing but the same indifference they had shown me for years. The beauty of it was that I didn't have to do anything dramatic. All I had to do was stay quiet and watch as their guilt grew louder by the day, and with each missed call I ignored, with each apologetic paragraph I refused to read in full, the balance of power shifted a little further until I could almost feel the panic vibrating off their words. My sister, who had always been the boldest when it came to mocking me, was the first to crack. She started with defensive anger, writing that I was overreacting, that it was just one event, and that I had made her look bad in front of people who didn't even know the full story. But within a day her tone shifted, because when I didn't respond, she sent another message about how she had planned to come, but something urgent came up, though she never said what it was, and then another message, late at night, where the cracks in her confidence were visible, admitting she had messed up and asking if we could talk. I read each line with the kind of calm I had never felt before, the kind of calm that comes when you know you finally stopped begging for crumbs and started letting people live with the mess they created. My father, on the other hand, tried to take the practical route, as though he could fix years of disregard with a few well-placed explanations. He wrote about how his work schedule was demanding, about how travel would have been expensive, about how he thought I would understand since I was so independent. It was almost comical how he tried to flip it, framing my independence, the very thing they had forced me into by never being supportive, as the reason I shouldn't be upset at their absence. For once, though, I didn't feel the urge to argue, to point out the hypocrisy, to break down all the ways in which his excuses didn't add up, because I knew ignoring him would sting far more than spelling it out. And then there was my mother, who tried every strategy in the book, switching from guilt to sympathy to nostalgia, like someone rifling through a drawer for the right tool. She left voicemails where her voice trembled as she reminded me of the family dinners we used to have, as if those evenings hadn't been filled with the same dismissive jokes and pointed silences that had pushed me to stop coming in the first place. She wrote that family comes first, even as the empty chairs from my big night proved the opposite, and when that didn't work, she tried to flip the narrative, saying that by calling them out I had hurt her, that I had made her feel excluded, as though she hadn't excluded me my entire life. Each attempt reeked of desperation, and the silence I gave her in return only deepened the wound, because it forced her to sit with the truth she didn't want to face, that her absence had cost her the right to claim closeness. Meanwhile, I leaned into the people who had actually shown up, the colleagues who not only attended but congratulated me afterward, the friends who had watched online and sent screenshots of the standing ovation. The strangers who had reached out to say my words gave them courage. I made a point of publicly thanking those people, both in private messages and on my platforms, never mentioning my family directly, but making it abundantly clear who had been there and who had not. Every post that celebrated the support I did receive made their absence stand out all the more sharply, not because I had to call them out again, but because silence and omission are sometimes louder than accusations. What fascinated me most was how quickly the story flipped. For years I had been the one chasing their attention, trying to prove my worth, trying to drag them into my world, but now they were chasing me, fumbling over themselves to be heard, desperate for me to acknowledge them, terrified of what it meant that I no longer needed them. And I can't deny the satisfaction that came with watching them scramble, because it was the first time I had ever seen them feel even a fraction of what they had made me feel countless times: small, overlooked, desperate, irrelevant. But I also knew that guilt, left alone, can sometimes fade, that people can eventually convince themselves they've done enough just by apologizing, and I wasn't going to let them wriggle out of this so easily. I wanted the silence to be the beginning, not the end, because if I had learned anything from years of being sidelined, it was that people like them needed to feel the consequences pressed down until they finally broke. And so, while they were spinning themselves in circles, drowning in the guilt I had placed squarely on their shoulders, I began planning the next step, the move that would ensure they would never forget what they had done. The move that would take their panic and sharpen it into the kind of lasting regret you can't smooth over with a few words. Because as powerful as silence was, I knew it was time to turn that guilt into something permanent, something they would carry with them long after the calls stopped, something that would remind them, every time they thought about me, that they had been erased from my world just as easily as they had once erased me from theirs. By the time a week had passed, the frantic energy in their voices and messages had shifted from excuses and explanations to pleading and bargaining. And I could practically hear the cracks widening in their carefully constructed image of themselves as a family that had never really abandoned me, even though the evidence of their absence was burned into a recording that anyone could watch again and again. What they never realized was that guilt alone was never going to be enough, because guilt, if left to fester, can eventually be rationalized away with lies and half-truths, and I knew them too well to let that happen. They were already spinning stories to themselves about why it hadn't been such a big deal, telling each other that I had overreacted, convincing themselves that I had embarrassed them more than they had embarrassed me. But I wasn't about to let the silence fade into another round of revisionist history where they got to walk away untouched. I wanted them to feel the permanence of what they had done, to understand in the deepest way possible that when they chose not to show up, they didn't just miss one event, they forfeited their place in my life. So I made the decision that felt at once terrifying and liberating. I cut them out. Not in the theatrical sense of announcing it in a public letter or staging some dramatic confrontation, but in the simplest, cleanest way that left no room for negotiation. I blocked their numbers on my phone, ensuring that no late-night call or panicked voicemail could reach me. I removed them from my accounts, including the shared financial arrangements that they had assumed were untouchable, things like the tuition fund my father had once smugly suggested I manage for my niece, or the health coverage my mother had used without a second thought, as if I were nothing more than a convenient resource they could tap while still refusing to acknowledge my worth. With a few clicks and signatures, those ties were severed, and for the first time I realized that the same independence they had mocked had become my sharpest weapon, because it gave me the ability to pull away fully, leaving them to feel the loss in tangible ways they couldn't dismiss with words. The reaction, of course, was immediate. Though I had blocked them, word filtered back to me through extended relatives and mutual contacts, people who called with hesitation in their voices to say things like, "Your mom is saying she doesn't know what happened," or "Your dad is in shock. He didn't think you'd actually cut them off," and I would just listen quietly, offering no explanations because I didn't know any. The point was not to convince anyone else of my reasons. The point was to make it clear that my family's choices had consequences, and those consequences had finally arrived. Meanwhile, the world outside of them kept moving, and I found myself busier than ever. The speech that they had chosen not to witness continued to ripple outward, opening doors I had only dreamed about, with people inviting me to speak at other events, colleagues introducing me to networks that would have been unreachable a year ago, and strangers writing to tell me that my words had struck a chord in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Every success became sharper, not because I needed to rub it in their faces, but because I knew they were watching from the outside now, unable to share in the glow, left to imagine what it would have been like if they had simply sat in those chairs and clapped. That image of 3 empty seats, forever captured on video as the backdrop to my turning point, was a reminder they would never escape, because they had created it themselves. What made it almost poetic was how ordinary my life began to feel without them, how much lighter every day was when I didn't carry the weight of trying to force them to care. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head, No longer crafted updates that I hoped might finally win a scrap of approval, no longer tried to shrink or stretch myself to fit their expectations. Instead, I poured my energy into the people who had proven they were worthy of it, the ones who had shown up not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect and belief in me. And while my family was left scrambling in their own regret, I was building something new, a life where their absence wasn't a wound anymore, but a decision, a clean line drawn by me. In the quiet moments, I sometimes wondered if they lay awake replaying the clip of me looking straight into the camera, delivering the sentence that had set all of this in motion, and whether they understood that those 6 words were not just for show. Not just a clever ending to a speech, but a boundary drawn in steel. Save your messages had not been a warning, it had been a promise, one I had kept without hesitation, because now the messages they were so desperate to send had no path to reach me, and the access they once took for granted was gone. And that, in the end, was the real revenge. Not anger, not screaming, not dramatic confrontations, but the simple, devastating fact that they no longer had the privilege of me. They could talk about me, they could speculate, they could replay their mistakes until it drove them crazy, but they couldn't reach me, and they couldn't undo what they had done. I had finally shifted the weight off my shoulders and onto theirs, and I knew it would stay there, pressing down, reminding them every time they saw my name in the news or heard someone mention me that they had chosen to erase themselves from the story. So when I think back on that night, standing on stage and looking out at the 3 empty chairs, I don't see failure anymore, and I don't see rejection. I see the beginning of the moment where I finally claimed myself, where I stopped waiting for validation that was never coming, and where I learned that sometimes the sharpest form of justice is not revenge at all but absence. Because absence leaves space for guilt to do its work, and guilt, when it has no escape, is heavier than anything I could have placed on them myself. And that weight, the one they now carry, is theirs to bear for as long as they live, while I walk away free.